Athens, 399 BCE. The city that invented democracy is packed into a courtroom, about to execute the man who invented the question. Forget the marble. Ancient Athens smelled like fish, dung, and unwashed bodies baking under a Mediterranean sun. The agora was philosophy's original battlefield. Reputations built and burned between olive stalls before noon. Into this chaos walked a short, snub-nosed man in the same filthy cloak, day after day, barefoot, bothering everyone. Nobody could stop talking about him. No army, no title, no money. One weapon, a question, aimed without mercy at generals, politicians, and priests who mistook power for wisdom. The formal charges, corrupting the youth, disrespecting the gods. The real crime, making important men look foolish in public, in front of crowds. Don't think of it as a teaching technique. Think of it as a rhetorical ambush. He'd agree with your premise, enthusiastically even, then dismantle it one question at a time until you couldn't define the thing you'd spent your life believing. Athens called itself the wisest city on earth. Socrates turned it into a city of people who no longer knew what they knew. In 2026, that's more radical than ever. We live inside algorithms engineered to confirm what we already believe. One honest question: what is this argument actually resting on? Can detonate 1,000 confident opinions. His friends had the escape arranged. Bribes paid. Boat waiting. He refused. Not from a death wish, but because fleeing would have made his entire life a lie. So he drank the hemlock. Calm. On his own terms. He never wrote a word. Everything we know came through his students. No Socrates, no Plato. No Plato, no Western philosophy. The man who claimed to know nothing built the foundation of everything. But Socrates was just the spark. The man who turned that spark into a wildfire was his most dangerous student. A man who would redesign reality itself. Watching his mentor drink hemlock, he walks away from that. Picture a young aristocrat watching his mentor drink hemlock. He walks away from that courtroom and spends the next 50 years trying to build a world where that never happens again. Plato came from money. Real money. He could have been a general, a politician, a poet. Instead, he planted a school in the olive groves outside Athens, the academy, and invented the idea of higher education. He wasn't writing philosophy for sport. He was designing a blueprint for the perfect society. Who should lead? Who should follow? What truth actually is? His answers made people uncomfortable then. They still do. Imagine a cave. Prisoners chained from birth, facing a blank wall. Behind them, a fire. All they've ever seen are shadows, and to them, the shadows are reality. One prisoner escapes, crawls toward sunlight. The pain is blinding, but slowly he sees the world as it actually is. Then he goes back to tell the others. They try to kill him. That's Plato's allegory of the cave. And it's not a thought experiment, it's a warning. Everything we scroll past, consume, and call real is a shadow on a wall. His Republic pushed it further. If most people are watching shadows, you don't want most people running the state. Philosopher kings, not elected politicians, should govern. Chilling, elitist, an idea that never fully disappears. In 2026, Plato's cave is the original simulation theory, the ancestor of every matrix reference, every conspiracy rabbit hole, every person convinced the official story is a projection. He shaped Christian theology, political theory, and the structure of Western universities for 2 millennia. Whitehead said all of Western philosophy is footnotes to Plato, not flattery, just fact. But his greatest student thought the old man had it completely wrong. His name was Aristotle, and he was about to drag philosophy off the clouds and force it to touch the ground. Courage, publicly contradicting your mentor, was rare in the ancient world. Dangerous even. Born in northern Greece, son of a royal physician, science was in his blood before philosophy was. He didn't just theorize. He dissected fish, catalogued plants, and analyzed constitutions. He also tutored a 13-year-old named Alexander. That boy went on to conquer the known world. The split between Plato and Aristotle is the original fault line of Western thought. Idealism versus empiricism, faith versus observation, the perfect form versus the thing you can actually touch. That argument is still running hot in science departments, philosophy classrooms, and culture wars in 2026. Aristotle invented formal logic, not as a parlor trick, but as a technology. The syllogism was the first algorithm for rational thought. His Nicomachean ethics reframed virtue entirely. It's not a rule you follow, it's a habit you build. Excellence, the golden mean, lives between extremes. Courage sits halfway between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity between stinginess and waste. His biology, cosmology, and physics dominated Western science for 1,800 years. He was spectacularly wrong about plenty of it. But his method, observe, classify, reason, is still exactly how science works. Every evidence-based argument made in the modern world carries his fingerprints. He is the godfather of critical thinking, biology, psychology, and political science simultaneously. He died in 322 BCE, a year after Alexander. His ideas survived the Dark Ages only because Islamic scholars preserved and refined them. Handed back to Europe by a civilization Aristotle never knew existed. Across the globe, at almost exactly the same moment, another man was asking the same hard questions about how to live, not in marble halls, but in the dusty courts of a crumbling Chinese state. While Athens debated the soul, China was fracturing. Warlords, corruption, a civilization tearing itself apart. One man believed the only way to fix a broken state was to fix broken people first. Confucius was not born into power. His father died young. He grew up poor, studied obsessively, and spent decades as a political advisor nobody wanted to listen to. For 13 years he wandered between states, pitching his ideas to rulers who nodded politely and changed nothing. He wasn't proposing a religion, he was proposing a civilization operating system, a set of values designed to hold society together when laws and armies failed. 5 virtues: benevolence, righteousness, propriety, wisdom, faithfulness, not abstract ideals, practical daily behaviors practiced until they became instinct. At the foundation sat filial piety, respect for parents and ancestors. Not as blind submission, but as the first classroom of character. If you can't honor the people who raised you, you can't govern anyone else. His politics followed the same logic. Rulers should lead by moral example, not force. A king who relies on coercion has already lost. A king who earns genuine respect doesn't need armies. In 2026, Confucianism isn't ancient history, it's active code. The emphasis on education, hierarchy, collective duty, and long-term thinking that defines modern East Asian business, family structure, and governance traces directly back to this wandering advisor nobody wanted. South Korea, Japan, China, Vietnam. Confucius is in the room whether he's named or not. His ideas were ignored in his lifetime. After his death, they became China's state philosophy for over 2,000 years. The Analects, compiled by his students, are still read, argued over, and taught today. But philosophy's next seismic shift didn't come from a classroom or a royal court. It came from North Africa, from a young man in moral freefall who would rebuild Western Christianity from the inside out. Brilliant, ambitious, and completely lost. He chased pleasure, he chased truth. He joined a cult, then left it. Then, in a garden in Milan, something broke open inside him that changed the Christian West forever. North Africa, under a crumbling Roman Empire. His mother Monica prayed for his soul with the same ferocity he applied to destroying it. He moved to Rome, then Milan, climbing the ladder of rhetoric and influence, while privately feeling that everything he touched was hollow. Christianity was barely a century past legalization. It needed an intellectual framework tough enough to survive philosophy's hardest questions. Augustine built that framework, and it held for 1,000 years. Original sin isn't just church doctrine, it's Augustine's answer to philosophy's oldest problem. Why do good people do terrible things? His answer was unflinching. Free will exists. But human nature is fractured at the root. Divine grace isn't optional. It's the only repair kit available. Then Rome fell. Visigoths sacked the Eternal City, and everyone blamed the Christians. Augustine wrote The City of God in response, a 14-year, million-word argument that Rome's collapse was political, not spiritual. The real city worth building, he said, was eternal and couldn't be sacked. In 2026, Augustine is the invisible architecture behind Western debates on free will, addiction, moral failure, and personal responsibility. Every time a courtroom argues over culpability, every time psychology asks why people self-destruct against their own interests, that's Augustine's framework still load-bearing. He died in 430 as the Vandals besieged his city. His books outlasted the empire. The Confessions, the first true autobiography in Western literature, still reads like it was written last Tuesday. 7 centuries later, another mind tried to finish what Augustine started, fusing Aristotle's rediscovered philosophy with Christian faith in a synthesis so ambitious it nearly broke the church in two. His family locked him in a castle to stop him joining a religious order. They sent a woman to seduce him out of his vows. He grabbed a burning stick from the fireplace and chased her out. Medieval Europe. The rediscovered works of Aristotle, arriving through Arabic translations, were detonating inside the church. Either Christianity absorbed this philosophy or was destabilized by it. Aquinas stepped deliberately into that war zone. If faith and reason were truly incompatible, the intellectual foundation of Western Christianity would crack. Aquinas refused to accept the premise. He spent his entire life proving they weren't enemies. They were partners. The Summa Theologica is one of the most ambitious intellectual projects in human history, a systematic attempt to answer every theological and philosophical question from first principles. Thousands of pages, 0 shortcuts, his 5 ways, 5 logical proofs for the existence of God, remain the most debated arguments in philosophy of religion. They're still being pulled apart and reassembled at Oxford and MIT today. Then there's natural law. Moral truth, Aquinas argued, isn't arbitrary divine command handed down from above. It's embedded in human nature and discoverable through reason alone. That single idea seeds the entire modern theory of human rights. In 2026, Aquinas is the foundation beneath Catholic social teaching, natural law arguments in constitutional courts, and every serious debate about whether science and religion can occupy the same room. Declared a doctor of the Church, the Summa remains required reading in Catholic seminaries worldwide. He died in 1274, and his influence has grown more substantial, not less, in every century since. But the Middle Ages were ending. A new age was coming, one that would rip authority from the Church and place it in the hands of a single, doubting human mind. Meet the man who started that revolution. He locked himself in a room, lit a stove for warmth, and decided to doubt everything he had ever believed. Absolutely everything. What he found at the bottom of that doubt changed philosophy forever. Europe, early 1600s. Galileo had just been hauled before the Inquisition for saying the earth moved. Descartes, devout Catholic, brilliant scientist, understood exactly what was at stake in getting ideas wrong. He was careful, strategic, and utterly ruthless in his thinking. He needed a foundation for knowledge that didn't depend on church authority or inherited tradition. He needed something no amount of doubt could dissolve. He found it in 3 words: cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Even if everything around you is illusion, even if a malicious demon is feeding your senses false data, the very act of doubting proves something is doing the doubting. The thinking self is the one certainty. You can't think your way out of existing. Cartesian dualism followed. Mind and body are fundamentally different substances. Not just different, categorically separate. That distinction launched centuries of argument in philosophy, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. Where does the mind end and the brain begin? We are nowhere near a consensus. His coordinate system fused algebra and geometry into a single language. His work on optics was foundational. Descartes wasn't just a philosopher. He was a one-man scientific revolution, operating under the Church's radar. In 2026, his method of systematic doubt is the grandfather of the scientific method, and his mind-body problem is the central puzzle of AI consciousness research. He moved to Sweden to tutor Queen Christina, philosophy lessons at 5 a.m. in an unheated palace. He was dead of pneumonia within months. Descartes built knowledge from inside the mind. But a man across the channel was making the opposite argument, that everything we know comes from the world pressing itself against our senses. He wrote the philosophy that toppled kings, not with armies, but with two thin treatises. His ideas didn't just influence the American Revolution, they were the American Revolution. England in the grip of political violence, civil war, regicide, the Restoration, the Glorious Revolution. Locke lived through every lurch and turned the chaos into theory. Who has the right to govern? Where does that right come from? What happens when a government violates its mandate? In 17th century England, these weren't academic questions. They decided who lived and who didn't. The mind at birth is a blank slate, tabula rasa. No innate ideas, no divine wisdom, no aristocratic birthright to understanding. Everything we know is built from experience pressing itself into consciousness. Natural rights followed the same logic. Life, liberty, and property aren't gifts from kings. They exist prior to government entirely. Government has exactly one job: protect those rights. Fail at that job, and the people don't just have the right to replace you, they have the obligation. That sentence is the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson didn't invent it. He took it almost directly from Locke, adjusted the vocabulary, and signed his name. In 2026, every functioning democracy, every human rights framework, every constitutional document on Earth carries Locke's architecture inside it. When you vote, you're performing a Lockean ritual. When a government is accused of overreach, the argument used against it was written in Somerset in the 1680s. His ideas seeded liberalism, constitutionalism, and the separation of powers. He died quietly in 1704. 72 years before the country his ideas built declared its independence. But Locke's trust in reason and experience was about to hit a wall. A Scottish skeptic was sharpening his pen, and when he was done, he'd left a hole in human knowledge that nobody has filled since. He may be the most dangerous philosopher on this list, not because he advocated violence, because he quietly proved that almost everything we think we know, we don't. Edinburgh, the Scottish Enlightenment. A city punching far above its intellectual weight. Hume entered university at 12. By his early 20s, he'd written a philosophy so radical he couldn't get an academic job for the rest of his life. Hume didn't just challenge a few ideas, he challenged the reliability of human reason itself, including the tools we use to do science. Start with cause and effect. We don't actually observe causation. We observe sequence. The sun has risen every morning of recorded history. But Hume says there is no logical guarantee it rises tomorrow. That's not pessimism, that's precision. The problem of induction. We use past experience to predict the future. But there's no logical justification for doing so. Science runs entirely on an assumption that Hume proved is unproven. He didn't destroy science. He just removed its philosophical flaw. His critique of the cosmological argument for God's existence gave him a permanent reputation as an atheist, genuinely dangerous in 18th century Britain. He also shaped economics through his close friendship with Adam Smith, produced serious historical scholarship, and wrote some of the most elegant English prose of his century. In 2026, Hume's skepticism is the reason science demands reproducible experiments. You can't just observe something once and declare it true. because sequence isn't causation. That's Hume, still running in the background of every laboratory on Earth. He died in 1776, the same year America was born, at peace, in good humor, with a healthy appetite. Kant said Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumber. That's the highest compliment one philosopher can pay another. Speaking of Kant, the man Hume woke up went on to write the most difficult and consequential philosophy of the modern era. But first, a restless Swiss wanderer who thought civilization itself was the problem. Abandoned by his father at 10, self-educated, paranoid, brilliant. He wrote the definitive book on raising children, while sending all 5 of his own to an orphanage. Enlightenment Europe, a continent drunk on reason, progress, and civilization. Rousseau was the man at the party who kept saying, "Has anyone considered that this might all be making us worse?" His ideas electrified the generation that launched the French Revolution. They also contain the seeds of some of the most dangerous political experiments in human history. Humans are naturally good. Civilization, property, and inequality corrupt them. The original sin isn't theological, it's social. The social contract built on that foundation. Legitimate government arises from the general will, the collective interest of the people as a whole, not merely the sum of individual preferences. A subtle distinction. Enormous consequences. His Emile rewired educational philosophy entirely. Children learn through experience, not rote drilling. Natural curiosity is sacred, not inconvenient. Progressive education in 2026 is still running mostly on Rousseau's operating system. His Confessions, raw, unflattering, compulsively honest, invented the modern memoir and lit the fuse of the entire Romantic movement. In 2026, Rousseau is the philosophical ancestor of both radical democracy and authoritarian populism simultaneously. Every demagogue who claims to speak for the real people, against corrupt elites, on behalf of an uncorrupted national soul, knowingly or not, they're speaking Rousseau's language. He died in 1778. 14 years later, the revolutionaries who idolized him were beheading people in his name. The distance between Rousseau's idealism and the terror is one of history's most sobering object lessons. And then there was the philosopher who read Rousseau, read Hume, read everyone, and decided the only honest response was to start completely over. Immanuel Kant. The man who almost never left his hometown and remade the entire map of human thought. So punctual that citizens set their clocks by his afternoon walk. He never married, rarely traveled more than a few miles from home, and wrote the books that redefined what it means to be a rational human being. Königsberg, a Prussian port city at the edge of the intellectual world. Kant spent almost his entire life there, tutoring privately before becoming a professor. The ideas came to him. Eventually, the world came too. Empiricists said all knowledge comes from experience. Rationalists said reason operates independently of it. Both camps were stuck in a deadlock. Kant found the exit. The Critique of Pure Reason is one of the hardest books ever written, and one of the most important. Its central claim: the mind doesn't passively receive the world, it actively structures it. Space, time, and causality aren't features of reality we discover. They're frameworks the mind imposes on experience before thinking even begins. Then the categorical imperative, his moral revolution. Act only on principles you could will to become universal laws. Don't lie. Not because God commanded it. Because a world where everyone lies is a world where language itself becomes meaningless. The rule collapses under its own universalization. And this, humans are ends in themselves, never merely means. You cannot use a person as a tool, regardless of the outcome. That sentence is the philosophical root of human dignity, human rights, and the entire edifice of modern bioethics. In 2026, Kant underpins international human rights law, medical ethics, and every serious argument that people possess inherent worth independent of their usefulness. He died in 1804, his mind fading, having outlived almost everyone he knew. His last words were reportedly, It is good. For a man who spent his life in pursuit of reason, that quiet acceptance was its own kind of argument. Kant had explained how the mind structures reality. His most brilliant and aggravating successor decided that reality itself was a process, always becoming, never finished. Hegel was about to make everything more complicated. He wrote books so dense his contemporaries accused him of hiding emptiness behind impenetrable language. His defenders said the critics simply weren't smart enough. The argument continues. Germany at the dawn of the 19th century. Napoleon was redrawing borders. Revolutions were cascading across Europe. History felt like it was accelerating, and Hegel wanted to know why. He wasn't just describing history. He was arguing that history has a direction, a logic, a destination, and that philosophy could decode it. Thesis meets antithesis. Conflict produces synthesis. That synthesis becomes the new thesis, and the engine starts again. This is the dialectic. History as a grinding, forward-moving argument that no single side ever fully wins. The world spirit, Geist, is the idea that history isn't random noise. It's the process of consciousness becoming aware of itself through human civilization. Empires rise, collide, and produce something neither side intended. That unintended product is progress. His philosophy of right reframed freedom entirely. Freedom isn't doing whatever you want. That's just appetite. Real freedom is achieved within the structures of family, civil society, and the rational state. Not against them, through them. In 2026, Hegel is everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Every academic who invokes dialectical tension, historical forces, or the contradictions of capitalism is speaking his language, usually without attribution. He is the invisible grammar of modern political and cultural theory. He died in 1831 during a cholera epidemic in Berlin. His students immediately fractured into left-wing and right-wing Hegelians, the first recorded instance of a philosopher's legacy being politically hijacked before the coffin was cold. One of those left-wing Hegelians took the dialectic, turned it upside down, and aimed it like a weapon at the entire capitalist order. His name was Karl Marx, and he was about to light the 20th century on fire. Broke, exiled, and largely unread throughout his life. He died in poverty in a London flat. Then, with a delay of a few decades, his ideas reshaped the entire political map of the world. Industrial England, children working in mines, factory owners growing obscenely rich, workers dead by 40. The gap between what capitalism promised and what it actually delivered was visible in the smog-blackened streets of Manchester and London. Marx believed capitalism wasn't a neutral economic system. It was a mechanism for systematic exploitation, engineered to keep the many poor so the few could compound their wealth. He wanted to prove it mathematically. Economic structures determine everything. Law, religion, culture, politics. The way a society produces things creates the stories it tells about itself to make that production feel natural and inevitable. That's the base building the superstructure. Class struggle is the engine beneath. Slaves and masters, serfs and lords, workers and owners. Every era generates its own central contradiction, and eventually that contradiction tears the era apart. Das Kapital was a 900-page autopsy of capitalism. Marx predicted its boom-bust cycles, its drift toward monopoly, its relentless global expansion. Many of those predictions landed with uncomfortable precision. The Communist Manifesto did it in 12 pages. Workers of the world, unite. In 2026, Marx's analysis of inequality, labor exploitation, and capital concentration is more urgently discussed than at almost any point since the Cold War. As wealth gaps widen to historic extremes, and automation threatens to dissolve entire labor markets, he was buried in Highgate Cemetery, London. The revolutions made in his name bore little resemblance to what he actually wrote. Whether that exonerates him or indicts him is the question that never closes. While Marx wanted to rebuild the world, the next man wanted to smash the entire frame. God, morality, truth, and all. Nietzsche wasn't interested in reform. He was interested in annihilation. Turin, 1889. A man threw his arms around a horse being beaten in the street and wept until he collapsed. He never recovered. But before the breakdown, he wrote the most explosive philosophy of the modern era, the 19th century in crisis. Darwinism had pulled the rug from under biblical creation. The old certainties, God, morality, the immortal soul, were cracking. Nietzsche looked at the crack and decided to widen it. If God is dead, if the foundation of Western morality has collapsed, what do we build on the ruins? Nietzsche had an answer. Most people weren't ready to hear it. God is dead. And we have killed him. Not a celebration, a diagnosis. The moral framework holding Western civilization together has been destroyed by science and reason, and most people haven't noticed yet. That delay, Nietzsche thought, was the real catastrophe. The Übermensch, the Overman, is not a racial fantasy. That distortion came later, courtesy of his sister. It's a philosophical challenge. In the absence of divine authority, who dares to create new values from scratch? The Overman doesn't inherit morality, he forges it. The will to power reframes human motivation entirely. The deepest drive isn't pleasure or survival. It's the expansion of strength, creativity, and self-overcoming. Eternal recurrence is his hardest question. Could you live so fully that you'd choose to repeat your life? Every joy, every humiliation, eternally. If not, examine what you're doing with your days. In 2026, Nietzsche is the father of existentialism, postmodernism, and a century of psychological inquiry into meaning-making. He has also been catastrophically misread by movements he would have despised. His sister edited his unpublished manuscripts to align with German nationalism. He would have been horrified. He spent his last 11 years in mental collapse, and his ideas spent the next 100 years in deliberate distortion. The real Nietzsche is harder than the myth, and considerably more necessary. Our final philosopher didn't want to destroy meaning or forge new values. He wanted something more radical, to show us that most philosophical problems were never real problems at all, just linguistic confusion. He gave away his family fortune, taught elementary school in a mountain village, worked as a hospital orderly during World War II, and wrote two philosophies so different from each other that the second one dismantles almost everything the first one claimed. Vienna at the turn of the century, one of the most intellectually fertile cities in human history. Freud, Klimt, Mahler, Schoenberg, and the young Wittgenstein, heir to one of the wealthiest families in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, quietly deciding to walk away from all of it. If language can't accurately represent reality, then every philosophical argument ever made is potentially just noise. Wittgenstein pursued that possibility with monastic intensity. Twice. The early Wittgenstein built a picture theory of language. Meaningful statements correspond to facts in the world. Everything else, ethics, metaphysics, the meaning of life, cannot be said. It can only be shown. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. He believed this solved philosophy. He left academia and became a village schoolteacher. Then he came back and dismantled everything he'd built. The later Wittgenstein said language isn't a picture, it's a toolbox. Words don't have fixed meanings that mirror reality. They get their meaning from use, from context, from what he called language games. There is no private language. Meaning is inherently social. And philosophical problems aren't deep mysteries waiting to be solved. They're confusions generated by misusing words. The cure isn't a better argument, it's clarity. In 2026, when researchers debate whether large language models genuinely understand meaning or merely manipulate symbols, that's Wittgenstein's question. His territory, still unresolved. He died of cancer in 1951. His last reported words, "Tell them I've had a wonderful life." For a man who wrestled with darkness his entire existence, that sentence is either the most profound thing philosophy ever produced or the best joke it ever told.